Chapter 9. Ramsey. Mercia headed to the crow's nest immediately upon her return to the magpie's wing, for her head was spinning both with the night's revelations and with the dying refrain of the music she'd heard. She desperately wanted to clear her brain, to try and make sense of everything that had happened. She'd been staring blankly out at the horizon for less than an hour before the creaking of the ladder roused her from her thoughts. She expected to see Rathbone, whose face seemed to be set in a permanent scowl these days, hauling himself up into the little wooden basket atop the mast. In fact, it was Shan who plopped down beside her, seemingly content to say nothing, and just stare placidly at the horizon. Mercia would have indulged him, but the crow's nest was scarcely big enough for two. "Is my shift over already?" she asked, trying to keep the irritation out of her voice and only partly succeeding. "I've always thought of myself as a bit of a tinkerer," Shan said conversationally, as if Mercia hadn't spoken. "Happy to let the ebb and flows carry me through life. Never really needed a long-term plan, as long as I've had something to keep me busy, content to go along with my crew. But it's just the four of us out here now, see? We need to be sure we're all dancing to the same tune, or we won't survive. And right now it feels like you and the captain are dancing a waltz while the rest of us are standing around a maypole." "That was some metaphor," Mercia said dryly. "Well, let me put it another way. What the hell is going on, Mercia? What did you find down in a soggy hole that's got us racing out to the middle of nowhere at full speed? The captain must know that Rathbone's angrier than a wasp in a wine bottle." Mercia let out a deep sigh. "If I told you, you wouldn't believe me. And I know that sounds like an excuse, Shan, but I'm not sure I believe me. Ramsey thinks you need to see for yourselves, like we did. If we just told you, there's every chance you'd think us both cracked, and we're going to need all of us dancing, as you put it, together tonight." Shan looked more pensive than she'd ever seen him. "Well, we've got a full hold and a fair wind," he said finally. "It's trust we're running low on. Hopefully, there's some to be found wherever it is we're heading." "There is, I promise. Or do I have to swear an oath?" "No oaths," said Shan. "But the next round is definitely yours." Mercia gave a nod and a small smile, and Shan swung nimbly back onto the ladder, dropping the last few feet to the deck. Rathbone, who was at the helm and grudgingly following Ramsey's directions, gave him an inquiring glance, but Shan merely shrugged and turned his attention to the sails. He could feel a cold glare boring into the back of his skull for the rest of their journey. They sailed until their maps and charts could guide them no farther, and Ramsey came above deck to stand moodily at the front of the ship, one hand on his compass and the other resting on the railing, as if urging the magpie's wing to move faster. When Mercia gave a curt whistle from on high, he began to move rapidly about the ship, extinguishing the lanterns one by one and half-furling the sails to slow their approach. It was easy to see why he wished to approach as covertly as they could, for three distinctive shapes were visible, even at this distance. A trio of galleons at rest, moored in a line that bent to follow the curve of a sandy beach. Ramsey bade them weigh anchor, lurking out of sight, behind a small atoll that disguised their profile. He led them down to the map room and unfurled a crude map he'd sketched so recently that the ink had barely had time to dry. "I'll keep this short, for we've not much night left. This island's a hideout for a group who've laid claim to these waters," he explained. "As you've seen, we're outnumbered, but no one knows we're here yet. If we're shrewd, we can get the drop on them. Their camp is deep within a cave system at the heart of the jungle. And if you follow the river from here to here, you'll spy it soon enough." He jabbed his thumb twice at the map. "Now, there could be a dozen pirates here, perhaps more, but they'll likely not all be together. Some will be asleep, some will be on watch, and others, well, Shannon Rathbone, that's where you come in. Use the river, head downstream into the cave, and keep as quiet as mice. You'll get to see how many are still at the camp. If I'm right, you'll also come to understand why we've come all this way. But you're not to pick a fight. You can't win. You hear me? Count heads and come home." "You make us sound like a group of reckless thugs," Shan said dryly, tracing the outline of the river with his finger as if he was trying to commit every bend to memory. "And where will you be?" Ramsey grinned in the moonlight. "Baiting traps." To Rathbone's continued annoyance, Shan insisted on total silence as they crouched and crawled their way through a dense and tangled mass of vines and undergrowth. Once or twice, they spotted drawings of the sort that always drew Mercia's attention on their travels. Strange runic depictions of what seemed to be swimmers praying to the sun. Or was it a pig? Something else entirely? They had more pressing concerns, Rathbone decided, and put it from his mind. They found the river easily enough, the bubbling spring at its source, guiding them by sound rather than sight. They traced its bank carefully as it wound its way through the disorienting labyrinth of trees and plants, though the thick jungle made it increasingly difficult to follow. Before long, they were forced to wade into the water, trying not to slip on sharp stones or lose their boots to the cloying mud. Eventually, the river itself delved underground, plunging into a gap between two rocks and down into darkness. It was deeper here, and the two men were forced to swim a short way, carefully holding their lanterns high over their heads so that they could still see. Luckily, the subterranean tunnel through which they moved opened out shortly after, and they were able to clamber out onto a broad ledge that ran parallel to the river. The lamplight revealed yet more painted swimmers adorning the walls, suggesting that this passageway had once been used regularly, though to what end was anyone's guess. They spent another hour crawling their way across slimy rocks, seeking out every safe handhold and foothold with painstaking care, for the river was flowing faster and more dangerously as they descended. They could hear the distant sound of a fiddle echoing in the distance, and reluctantly snuffed out their lights. Both men inched forward in the inky blackness, guided now only by the music and the susurration of the ever-rushing water. Finally, the path began to brighten with the flickering orange of a distant campfire, and they could hear the raucous laughter of people enjoying themselves. Here they paused, for moving any closer would risk stepping into view of a dozen unwelcoming pirates. Somehow, they needed to see without being seen. As Rathbone chewed his lip in thought, his eyes came to rest on another of the faded cave paintings. Like the others, this one seemed to make little sense. Two rows of stick figures, one above the other, with a zigzag of dots between the groupings, and a boar's head in the center. It seemed a strange place to have left such a doodle, and he stared at it for a moment, before an idea struck him. What if it was more than just a piece of primitive art? Reaching out to caress the wall around the drawing, Rathbone's questing fingers found the first foothold carved crudely into the rock. As he suspected, the image was instructional, guiding him toward a series of alcoves that would allow him to reach the hideout's upper level. He began to haul himself higher and higher, moving each of his limbs in turn to find the next niche, until he was eventually splayed out on a high ledge. He helped Shan climb up alongside him, and together the two men wriggled forward on their bellies, peering down from the darkness. The high shelf onto which they'd climbed acted almost as a gallery, surrounding and overlooking a large central cavern into which they could peek without being spotted. It was here that the pirates had made their home, and just as the drawing depicted, there was an enormous boar skull dominating the scene. It was huge, larger than any living beast Shan had seen, and it had been placed reverentially atop an ornate plinth carved out of the rock itself, with several smaller skulls and miscellaneous bones scattered around it. The cackling revelers below paid it no heed, however. There were 8 that Shan could see in total, though 2 were snoring loudly. Those who were still awake were focused on jeering and cavorting around a large wooden construction, and Rathbone eased himself out over thin air so that he could get a better look at it. "It's a cage," he thought in surprise. Stretching forward as far as he dared, he could just about make out 2 figures huddled within the stout bars. Prisoners, and mistreated ones, for those pirates who hadn't collapsed into a drunken stupor were poking at them with sticks and issuing mocking threats. For a moment, Rathbone feared that it might be Ramsey and Mercia, that they'd been captured, and that the magpie's wing was now either seized or scuttled at the enemy's hands. Ramsey would never sit that quietly, he considered. And he mentioned something about friends. Who could he have meant? Well, if he couldn't see, he'd just have to listen. "Oi, Douglas," one of the pirates belched. "How comes I has to go on watch next day? It's not like anyone even knows we're here." He blew his nose noisily on the hem of his coat, and, upon discovering his bottle was empty, tossed it in a lazy arc into the river. The largest man, whose ruddy face was framed by a lion's mane of bright red hair, growled. "You'll go because I said so, Gripper. And because you don't want my blade in your belly. This is the biggest catch of our lives, and if I learn anyone's put our plunder at risk because they were too lazy or too stupid to stick to the plan, I'll personally feed him to the sharks one piece at a time, and I'll save the eyes till last so they can watch." A bully, Rathbone thought, but an effective one. If he's got 3 ships at his command. Once he's cut down, however. It was tempting, here in the darkness, to simply draw his pistol and put a shot between those piggy little eyes. But it would also likely be the last thing Rathbone ever did. Gripper, it seemed, was either too daft or too drunk to know when not to push his luck. "Yeah, well, that one won't eat what we gives it anyway," he complained, delivering a savage kick to the cage. "If you ask me..." Douglas moved so quickly that Rathbone never even saw the shot. He heard the bang, though, and felt it echo around the cavern with a deafening boom that silenced every pirate instantly. They, along with Rathbone and Shan high above, stared wordlessly at Gripper as he toppled forward, his limp form tumbling down the rocky slopes and into the river to bob away along with his bottle. The scene was a frozen tableau, for no one dared to be the first to speak, at least until a rumpled-looking young pirate tore into the room. She was breathless and looked to have sprinted for some distance. "Fire!" she yelled. "Ship afire!" That was enough to snap the assembled pirates from their horrified trance, and they began to clamor in confusion. "Zoons!" Douglas bellowed.
Is it treachery? Or just another fool who wants to dance with a cat o' nine tails? Never mind,
he added, immediately answering his own question. Hauling the two sleeping pirates to their feet, he dragged them to the river and dunked their heads under for several seconds, assuring he had their full attention when he finally dropped them back on dry land.
Take Norris, Smiley and Bo and make sure every single ship is as it should be. And if you find the ones who've tried to scupper us, you're to leave them alive till I get there. You understand?
Smiley, but we can't find...
the pirate whimpered, then thought better of arguing. Wordlessly, she and her dripping comrades fled from Douglas's fury and out of the caves as fast as their unsteady legs could carry them.
You two,
Douglas growled, rounding on two startled young men who were trying to linger at the back of the crowd.
Stay here and guard the prisoners. Everyone else, form search parties.
He lumbered toward the cave's main entrance.
There's no one who knows this island better than us. Whoever's out there will be shark bait by morning.
Cursing and muttering, he and his crew filed out of the cave and out of sight. That just left two bewildered pirates staring blankly at one another, so confused by the sudden turn of events that they were completely unprepared when Rathbone and Shan dropped from overhead and felled them like two sacks of potatoes. Once he was satisfied both men were out cold, Rathbone stepped out of the shadows and holstered his weapon.
Don't worry,
he called out to the occupants of the cage.
We're friends. We're here to help.
I'm not sure they'll understand you. Shan had already moved to the bars of the cage, which was half submerged in a deep pool, and gotten a clear look at its occupants. Now the older man looked as pale as a fresh sheet, the first time Rathbone could remember seeing him visibly shaken. With some trepidation, Rathbone stepped and stared into the cage. From within its confines, their yellow eyes blazing in the firelight, two merfolk stared back. Smiley the pirate was having the worst night of his life. He'd been given first watch, which was bad enough. That meant that while he was out patrolling the rough pathways and passages that crisscrossed the island hideaway, the others were back at camp with the best of the evening meal and, more likely than not, a fresh cask of grog to accompany it. By the time Smiley got back, he was lucky to find a plate of cold leftovers to call his own. Then there was the snake, which began coiling its way around his leg as he stopped for a quiet smoke out of the wind. Smiley hated snakes, and though he'd managed to slip out of his boot just in time, he hadn't dared approach the wretched creature to reclaim it. Now he was hobbling around the island with one stockinged foot, feeling foolish. To make matters worse, his arm seemed to be getting worse. He'd snuck another look at it earlier, when no one was around. 4 days had passed since he defied Douglas's orders and snaffled a golden idol for himself while exploring one of the island's many shrines. Now shadowy flecks of amber were visible in the veins of his hand and wrist, as if the little totem had been under some protective magic or other. His little finger was almost completely immobile now, but he didn't dare tell the others, in case they decided a solid gold arm was worth more than Smiley himself. Finally, as Smiley trudged along his route, feeling immensely sorry for himself, a man the size of a small bear had plummeted out of the treetops and landed on his head. Now Smiley was hanging upside down from a sturdy branch, bound and gagged. The terrifying figure and his accomplice made Smiley spill his guts about everything Douglas's gang had been up to, how many of them were on the island, and the plan for their 2 prisoners. When Smiley mentioned the bit about taking the merfolk far from the Sea of Thieves to sell, the woman struck him with a blow that he felt sure ought to have taken his head clean off. Even so, he begged her to take him prisoner, lock him in the brig, or even make him walk the plank out at sea. Anything seemed better than being found by Douglas and made to explain himself. He'd been left swinging regardless, high in the branches and too ashamed to even call for help. Smiley was forced to watch as one of their 3 ships was set ablaze, lamp oil burning brightly across her deck and flames bubbling the paint of the hull. 3 of his shipmates raced aboard, buckets in hand to extinguish the blaze, only to be blasted into the ocean by cannon fire from their sister ship, which was now under control of the trespassers. Douglas and his search party located Smiley shortly after, and he hung forlornly, confessing everything. He begged to be cut down, to be allowed to rejoin the fight and take revenge. But Douglas spat on the ground below him and declared that Smiley could be left there to rot as far as he was concerned, an example to others. Now Smiley was swinging, trying to get enough momentum to hack his sword into the bindings that held his feet. His wild swipes were missing by mere inches as he rocked back and forth. Finally, by curling his stomach as tight as it could go, he managed to land a blow that struck more by luck than judgment. It was only enough to fray the stout rope, but it spurred Smiley into landing a second blow, then a third. There was a lurch, a snap, and Smiley was in free fall, landing painfully on the hard ground, face first. After a moment lying in a painful private world of his own, he reached beneath himself and began groping around, for he'd landed on something that was proving incredibly uncomfortable. Forcing himself onto his hands and knees, he pulled the mysterious object out from under his belly. It was a boot. His boot, Smiley realized, with a rising sense of dread. His boot, and a very, very angry snake.
"Hurry up!"
said Rathbone, for the 5th time in as many minutes.
"I thought you said you could pick the lock."
He was pacing, agitated, trying to keep watch on all possible entrances at once, while Shan crouched in the icy water and fumbled at the door of the cage. The merfolk within stared impassively as he stamped back and forth.
"I did say that,"
Shan agreed, his speech rather slurred, thanks to the selection of slender metal implements clenched between his teeth.
"But the thing about this lock, the main thing about this lock, right, is what? Is that I can't pick it,"
Shan admitted, spitting his tools back into his hand and clambering out of the pool.
"Not without the rest of my tools. I don't suppose—"
"No," said Rathbone firmly. "We'd never make it to the ship and back before that Douglas and his thugs caught up to us." He swore and shook his head in disbelief.
"Merfolk. I mean, you always heard the stories, but never expected to see them in the flesh."
Shan had to admit that Rathbone was right. The 2 creatures were captivating. Their faces were mostly human, with features that suggested one was male and the other female, though a few lines here and there hinted at the existence of gills and fins somewhere in their heritage. Their skin looked tough, like flattened scales, and seemed to be slightly pearlescent, shifting between white and silver depending on how you looked at them. Much of their bodies were wrapped in a strange, smooth material that looked like nothing he'd ever seen before and seemed to flow effortlessly in water. The coverings extended all the way down past their waists and tied together neatly in a point, making it impossible to tell with any certainty whether they were disguising something approaching a pair of human legs or, like the legends promised, an enormous fish-like tail. The two Mer had been watching the two men intently with large and doleful expressions, but so far they'd given no indication that they understood anything that was being said. Forcing himself to think less about the cage's occupants and more about the current predicament, Shan began to join Rathbone in pacing around the cave.
So, we can't pick the lock, can't smash the bars. Reckon all four of us could carry the cage?
No, Rathbone said curtly.
Even if we could, who knows if merfolk can survive out of water? We need the key, and somehow I doubt Douglas is just going to hand it over.
You know, I think he might. Rathbone's hand went to his pistol, for Douglas's looming form had appeared at the entrance to the cave, but the voice was Ramsey's. He came in close behind the furious pirate, holding him at sword point.
Personally, I was hoping he'd have swallowed it for safekeeping, so I'd have the pleasure of cutting it out of him. But young Smiley tells me it's on a chain around his neck. You've no business coming here and meddling in my affairs, you self-righteous prig!
Douglas snarled.
Just 'cause you got here first doesn't mean you run the whole damn ocean.
Not yet, Ramsey muttered, and there was a glint in his eye as he spoke those words.
But I know more about being a pirate than you ever will, boy. And what separates us from kings and queens is we don't treat people like things. Not out here. Not even if we hate 'em more than anything in the world. People aren't property.
He practically spat the last word as he reached for the key to the cage. It was rare for Ramsey not to be the tallest person in the room, but he almost had to stand on tiptoe to grasp the silver chain around his captive's neck. He made no effort to lift the key away, but merely gave a savage yank so that Douglas choked and the necklace snapped. Ramsey tossed the key to Shan, who caught it ably and began to fumble with the cage's lock while the merfolk looked on, silent as ever. There were quiet footsteps behind him, and he turned to address Mercia as she entered.
Did you find the rest of his little gang?
All awake, but tied up tight, she confirmed, and a bit singed. No wonder, she reflected, considering the amount of gunpowder she and Ramsey had tipped over Douglas and his crew as they'd re-entered the camp, covering them in a thick grey coat. The expression on Ramsey's face as he dropped a burning torch down onto the group was one she wouldn't forget in a hurry. Mercia stepped forward, giving a little smile in the direction of the merfolk. They all watched in anticipatory silence as Shan slid the key into the cage's lock, though Douglas still shook in barely suppressed rage. The door swung wide open, and that was when everything happened at once. Smiley, who had snuck back into the camp just in time to witness Douglas's capture, decided that this was his opportunity to make amends. He leapt down from the dark ledges overhead, with a loaded blunderbuss in his hands. But as he landed, his leg, bloodied and swollen by a dozen snake bites, gave out from under him. Smiley lost his footing, tumbled into the rock pool, and bashed his head against the cage. The ambush seemed to finally startle the merfolk into motion, and they fled from their prison, diving into the waiting river with two great splashes. What happened to them next, no one could say for sure. As Smiley's frantic thrashing sent water cascading in all directions, extinguishing the hideout's campfire and casting the cave into darkness. Seizing his chance in the confusion, Douglas stepped forward, turning to swing a vicious punch at the captain who'd cost him his prisoners. Ramsey, feeling the bulk of the man shifting away from him in the darkness, was faster. His sword came down sharply against Douglas's ribs, tearing through his tunic with ease. And yet, to his surprise, the blade seemed to bounce away as harmlessly as if he'd struck stone. He had just enough time to land a second, equally ineffectual strike against the man's leg before being lifted clean off his feet as Douglas's fist connected. It felt like being hit by a sack full of broken bricks. Ramsey flew backward, crashing into the boar's head and dislodging it from its place atop the altar. Disturbing the remains appeared to trigger some kind of ancient mechanism, possibly a trap, left behind to protect the shrine, for the ground immediately began to quake. A ghostly blue light flooded the cave as the entire monument began to glow. It illuminated Douglas, who was standing over the fallen Ramsey with a large boulder held high above his head, meaning to crush him. He might very well have succeeded, had Shan not scrambled for the blunderbuss lying next to Smiley's stricken form and unloaded its contents into the giant's back. Douglas staggered, but did not fall. And as he shrugged off the shredded remains of his coat, the others could finally see why. Almost half of Douglas's swarthy body was calcified, his skin the texture of roughly hewn stone.
"Caught myself a little curse a while back,"
he roared gleefully as he caught their astounded expressions.
"Must have stolen something what didn't want stealing."
Behind him, a fine trickle of sand began to pour from the ceiling.
"Reckon I don't have long left, but I'll last longer than ye curs."
He brought the rock down against the altar with enough force that the stone plinth actually cracked. But Ramsey was no longer upon it, having disentangled himself and rolled aside just in time. More dirt was cascading down now, and the cave's exit was already half blocked by rubble. Whatever the purpose of the shrine had once been, its desecration had triggered an avalanche that looked set to entomb them all. Ramsey ducked another of Douglas's blows, searching wildly for a weapon that might pierce that unnaturally thick hide. But a large slab of stone, crashing down an inch to his left, made him reconsider the wisdom of fighting a rock-skinned bear moth in a rapidly collapsing cave. The merfolk, he realized, were nowhere to be seen, and he realized what that must mean.
"Into the water!"
he bellowed at the others, staggering as a rocky fist grazed his cheek and left a deep cut across it.
"Before we're buried alive!"
One by one, his crew threw themselves into the raging river, and Ramsey ducked under Douglas's outstretched arms to do the same.
"You'll not get away!"
Douglas howled, leaping into the river after Ramsey, as if to grab him in a great bear hug. Only when he hit the water did his beady eyes widen in fear and understanding. For while Ramsey was buoyed along on the river's foamy surface, Douglas himself was far less fortunate. The curse of his stony flesh bore him helplessly down to the riverbed, and while he tenaciously tried to take a few faltering steps after the fleeing pirates, it was clear that he'd never be able to hold his breath long enough to escape. After a moment, Douglas was forced to scramble back onto the riverbank, buckling under blows from tumbling rocks as he scrabbled uselessly against the rubble in search of an exit. There was an almighty crack. More enormous stones crashed down into the cave, and a billowing curtain of dust took him at last from Ramsey's sight. The river carried them carelessly outside, bumping and scraping them all off rocky outcroppings, and once plunging them over a small waterfall. They were all bruised and battered as they finally staggered back onto dry land, finding themselves only a short distance from the magpie's wing. Exhausted, they stumbled back up the gangplank and would have fallen asleep then and there, if not for a strange keening sound that seemed to take up all around the ship. Looking over the railings, the four pirates saw that they were flanked on every side by at least 100 merfolk. It was hard to tell exactly, for they were all cavorting in celebration, diving and flipping and spiraling around one another.
What's this?
Rathbone asked, bemused but curious.
They come to thank us? More than that,
said Ramsey cheerfully, clapping Rathbone on his aching back and making him wince.
They've come to keep up their part of the bargain.